This is GARIS, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 395, entitled Pondering the Para. Description. This flyer discusses the details of the legislation of the para, that's paternity, rejection, right. It takes the form of a decision tree, where at each node a question is asked, and depending on whether the answer is yes or no, the next question is found at the left or right hand node. The details of this decision tree will need to be worked out in detail, and policies will need to be decided before the para becomes law, as it must, if men are ever to be freed from decades-long manslavery at the hands of women who dictate paternity onto them, thus ruining men's lives. Women have the mara, men don't have the para, the greatest form of sexual discrimination that exists. Now the flyer itself. Pondering the Para by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Maybe once or twice a year I come up with a topic that gives me the intuitive feeling that, in brackets, quotes, this flyer is important. It contains ideas that will probably influence millions of lives in the future. End quote. I was recently listening to a podcast on Isaiah Berlin, the philosopher, intellectual, who spoke about the power of ideas, of the isolated professor in his study dreaming up ideas that change the world. He was thinking of Marx in particular. That idea of his really resonated with me because just prior to listening to that podcast, I'd thought of the title to this masculist flyer, that is, Pondering the Para, and the thought occurred to me that the ideas and policy suggestions I'd be making in that flyer, in other words this one, could influence millions of people in the future when and if the para, and that's paternity rejection right, is legislated. So, listening to Berlin's opinions on the power of the ideas of isolated professors really resonated with me, since I'm an isolated professor sitting in my study dreaming up, in brackets, masculist ideas and filming them with my webcam and uploading them for the world to read on video hosting sites like Minds and BitChute, and in brackets, but not YouTube, which censors, whose CEO is an MFB, that's a monoconscious feminazi bigot, a sexist hypocrite who promotes feminist and deletes whole masculist channels. So why do I feel this way? How will the legislation of the para impact the lives of millions of people in the future? Before I launch into answering that, I need to give some context on the need for the para itself. The legislation of the para is one of the main political goals of the masculists, along with the creation of a FIP society, in which all boys and girls are socialized by parents and educated by teachers and professors to become FIPs, that's financially independent persons, so that they do not grow up to be fluffies, based on the word fluff, the masculist label for traditional women who expect to be able to parasite off the money and labor of a man, who are the enemies of the masculists, seen as manslavers, as immoral, parasitic, manslaving vermin to be wiped out by being totally ignored by the masculists, not even pumped and dumped, forcing their fluffy parasite genes to be removed from the gene pool. That is, the masculists are out to literally annihilate the fluffies, forcing them to convert themselves into FIPs, or be ostracized from society by being made manless and hence loveless, sexless, babyless and spat at for being hateable manslavers and hence slavers to be hated. To combat manslavery by women, for example, when women lie to their boyfriends/husbands about taking the pill, when in reality they aren't, get pregnant, then force a man to pay for that kid for decades of his life, thus manslaving him for decades. To prevent this kind of massive gender crime against men by women, the masculists are pushing for the legislation of the para, which will give men the legislated right to reject an unwanted pregnancy, which would be the obvious equivalent to women's MARA, maternity rejection right, the right of women to reject an unwanted pregnancy, so that the rest of her life is not destroyed by being forced into pregnancy and decades of motherhood that she does not want. The second wave feminists in the 70s and 80s fought hard politically to get the MARA, aka the abortion right. They got it, and now it's men's turn to get the same thing, the para, and for similar reasons. As masculists push hard for the legislation of the para, we will see with greater clarity women's real attitudes towards men, that is, in quotes, seeing men as cash machines
put on this earth to pay for women to have babies.
When push comes to shove, women will be forced by masculist political pressure to choose between having a baby or giving up their fluffy feminist hypocritical privileges in the divorce courts, as masculists force women into babylessness, since young men refuse to marry and have kids in an era in which the divorce courts remain under the control of the hated fluffy feminists, that is, monoconscious fluffy feminists who are, by definition, familiar with feminist ideas, that is, have had their feminist consciousnesses raised, but not their masculist consciousnesses raised. They are thus familiar with how men oppress women, but not with how women oppress men, for example, by forcing an undesired paternity onto a man, thus manslaving him in capital letters for decades. Thus, these fluffy feminists who control the divorce courts still have traditional expectations of men, seeing men as cash machines to be abused and robbed by divorcing mothers, so that these men are financially crucified and have their lives ruined by losing custody of his kids with a 90% probability, losing his house to his fluffy ex-wife, half his wealth to her, forced to pay child support to kids he may be allowed to visit only 2 weekends a month, and forced to pay alimony to his fluffy ex-wife so that she remains a parasite of him after the divorce the way she was before the divorce. One father in 4 suffers this massive gender crime against men. It's therefore not surprising that masculists are talking increasingly about a sex war in which masculist soldiers assassinate the gender politicians who made these massively gender politically unjust laws in the first place and murder thousands of monoconscious fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges. There's such an anger, a bitterness and hatred coming from masculists and MGTOWs, that's men going their own way, that if the gender laws are not soon men-fared, then a sex war of the above style will become inevitable and millions of women, especially fluffy feminists, will die. Masculists see manslavery as slavery. Slavery rouses passions. Slavery is a war issue. Look at the rise of the US Civil War. The masculists are at war against the fluffy parasites and the fluffy feminist hypocrites who are destroying the lives of one father in 4. In light of the above, you can readily understand why the legislation of the para is so important to the masculists, the achieving of which will probably prove to be as tough a challenge to masculists as was achieving the right to vote for women by the suffragettes. Once the para has become the right of every man, women will no longer be able to force an unwanted pregnancy on a man, thus manslaving him for decades. Masculists, who are well informed of masculist ideas and rhetoric, put enormous moral pressure on fluffy feminists, haranguing them out of the room, expressing hateful masculist anger at the hypocrisy of the fluffy feminists who want equal rights with men in the parliaments, but reject equal obligations with men by refusing to fip up, by refusing to accept the idea that women have a powerful moral obligation to share the burden of earning the living by bothering to get a career-competent education at high school and college, so that they grow up to be FIPs, as economically responsible adults, pulling their own financial weight and not expecting fluffy style to be able to parasite off the money and labour of a man. Fluffies and fluffy feminists are hated by the masculists, so when the masculists push for the legislation of the para, and feminists object that masculinist anger and hatred will express itself in a tirade of male testosterone, verbalised in the form of a masculinist tirade that blows the feminazi bitches out of the room. For example, imagine a masculist having his masculist button pressed strongly in a mixed sex meeting by a feminazi who thinks that men should pay for women to have babies, expressing the opinion that, quote,
"The man who penises pays."
The masculist stands up in rage and delivers the following hateful masculist tirade to the feminist, in quotes, "You fat, ugly, unfuckable, misandrist, male-dumping feminazi bitch. You women have the MARA, the maternity rejection right. You women have the legislative right to reject an unwanted pregnancy, but men don't. And you think that men should be forced to pay for a kid he doesn't want, that the woman does want. That makes you a hated, two-faced hypocrite that will eventually get you killed by masculinist soldiers, full of hatred against the massive gender crimes that you feminazi hypocrites are perpetrating. You reject the idea of what is good for the goose should be good for the gander. You're just a female chauvinist pig wanting power for women, privileges for women at the expense of men. So when there's a pregnancy, the woman can choose or not choose to have it. But the man can't. He's forced to have it if the woman chooses to have it. You don't give a shit about the welfare of men. You callous, misandrist, feminazi bitch, the most hated category of women by men, punished severely by men by totally ignoring you, forcing your feminazi genes to be removed from the gene pool. Your utter hypocrisy and callousness towards men have made you the most hated of females, and you will pay a very heavy price. You will either be forced to rot on the shelf, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and spat at by an ever-growing masculinist-friendly culture, or you'll be simply killed by masculinist soldiers if the sex war comes. If you want to survive and not be excluded from society, I suggest you become bi-conscious by learning masculist ideas as well, and then vote with men for the men-fairing of the gender laws, especially the legislation of the para, so that men are prepared to be fathers again, so that whole cultures don't wipe themselves out, which is what you feminazis are currently doing, acting as indirect genociders, since you have taken over the divorce courts and made them so toxic for men with your fluffy feminist hypocritical attitudes that 2/3 of men in many countries now reject marriage and paternity. So the birth rate is now under 1 child per woman in many countries now, wiping ourselves out in a mere few generations. You feminazis have become culture-siders. You have to be stopped with a sex war if necessary. You are hated by the masculists and by young childless women, whom quality masculisted men refuse to give their sperm to, given the hated toxicity of the divorce courts that you fluffy feminazis control. We masculists tell these young women that the reason the quality young men they really want to mate with, in brackets, to get the quality DNA from quality men for their kids, close brackets, don't give them their sperm, is that modern marriage and paternity really sucks for men, so they reject both and go their own way. I hope you see the sense in what I'm saying and act on it. Otherwise, you will live the rest of your short life hated and ignored and later killed in the sex war. This is the end of part 1.